The wind was picking up now, blowing clouds across the moon, shrouding the garden in darkness. "Stay up with me?" Jesus asked his friends. They said yes and waited under the olive trees, but they were tired and soon they fell asleep. Jesus walked ahead alone into the dark. He needed to talk to his heavenly Father. He knew it was time for him to die. They had planned it long ago, he and his Father. Jesus was going to take the punishment for all the wrong things anybody has ever done or ever would do. "Papa, Father," Jesus cried, and he fell to the ground. "Is there any other way to get your children back? To heal their hearts? To get rid of the poison?" But Jesus knew there was no other way. All the poison of sin was going to have to go into his own heart. God was going to pour into Jesus' heart all the sadness and brokenness in people's hearts. He was going to pour into Jesus' body all the sickness in people's bodies. God was going to have to blame his Son for everything that had gone wrong. It would crush Jesus. But there was something else, something even more horrible. When people ran away from God, they lost God. It was what happened when they ran away. Not being close to God was like a punishment. Jesus was going to have to take that punishment. Jesus knew what that meant. He knew he was going to lose his Father, and that, Jesus knew, would break his heart in two. Violent sobs shook Jesus' whole body. Then Jesus was quiet, like a lamb. "I trust you, Papa," he said. "Whatever you say, I will do." Suddenly, through the trees, a glitter of starlight flashed off steel. Into the quiet garden came whispers, muffled voices, clanking metal, and the sound of boots marching. Jesus stood up. He woke his friends. "Now is the time," he said gently. "Everything that was written about me, what God has been telling his people all through the long years, it's all coming true." And into the night, with burning torches and lanterns, with swords and clubs and armor they came, an army of soldiers. Judas led them straight to Jesus so they could arrest him. Jesus was waiting for them. Peter leapt up, took a sword, and tried to defend Jesus. He sliced off a guard's ear. Jesus immediately touched the guard and healed him. "Peter," he said, "this is not the way." Peter didn't realize that no army, no matter how big, could ever arrest Jesus, not unless Jesus let them. Then Jesus, who had never done anything except love people, was arrested as if he were a criminal. Jesus' friends were afraid, so they ran away and hid in the dark shadows. The guards marched Jesus off and took him to the leaders. The leaders put Jesus on trial. "Are you the Son of God?" they asked. "I am," Jesus said. "Who do you think you are, to call yourself God? You must die for calling yourself the Son of God." Only the Romans were allowed to kill prisoners, so the leaders made a plan. "We'll tell the Romans, this man wants to be our king, and then they will crucify him." But it would be all right. It was God's plan. "It was for this reason that I was born into the world," Jesus said.
So you're a king, are you? The Roman soldiers jeered. Then you need a crown and a robe. They gave Jesus a crown made out of thorns and put a purple robe on him and pretended to bow down to him. Your Majesty, they said. Then they whipped him and spat on him. They didn't understand that this was the Prince of Life, the King of heaven and earth, who had come to rescue them. The soldiers made him sign, "Our King," and nailed it to a wooden cross. They walked up on a hill outside the city. Jesus carried the cross on his back. Jesus had never done anything wrong, but they were going to kill him, the way criminals were killed.
They nailed Jesus to the cross. "Father, forgive them," Jesus gasped. "They don't understand what they're doing." "You say you've come to rescue us," people shouted, "but you can't even rescue yourself." But they were wrong. Jesus could have rescued himself. A legion of angels would have flown to his side if he'd called. "If you were really the Son of God, you could just climb down off that cross," they said. And of course they were right. Jesus could have just climbed down. Actually, he could have just said a word and made it all stop, like when he healed that little girl and stilled the storm and led 5,000 people. But Jesus stayed. You see, they didn't understand. It wasn't the nails that kept Jesus there. It was love. "Papa," Jesus cried, frantically searching the sky. "Papa, where are you? Don't leave me." And for the first time and the last, when he spoke, nothing happened. Just a horrible, endless silence. God didn't answer. He turned away from his boy. Tears rolled down Jesus' face, the face of one who would wipe away every tear from every eye.
Even though it was midday, a dreadful darkness covered the face of the world. The sun could not shine, the earth trembled and quaked. The great mountains shook, rocks split in two, until it seemed that the whole world would break, that creation itself would tear apart. The full force of the storm of God's fierce anger at sin was coming down, on his own son instead of his people. It was the only way God could destroy sin, and not destroy his children whose hearts were filled with sin. Then Jesus shouted in a loud voice, "It is finished," and it was. He had done it. Jesus had rescued the whole world. "Father," Jesus cried, "I give you my life," and with a great sigh, he let himself die. Strange clouds and shadows filled the sky, purple, orange, black, like a bruise.
Jesus' friends gently carried Jesus. They laid Jesus in a new tomb carved out of rock. How could Jesus die? What had gone wrong? What did it mean? They didn't know anything anymore, except they did know their hearts were breaking. "That's the end of Jesus," the leader said. But just to be sure, they sent strong soldiers to guard the tomb. They hauled a huge stone in front of the door to the tomb so that no one could get in or out.
This past weekend, a good friend of mine passed away. She was a colleague. I had known her for a number of years. We had done a number of kind of shared ministry things together, and I had come to deeply respect and appreciate her. Now, this wasn't really a surprise. She had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and despite some moments of optimism along the way, most of us knew how this story was going to end. Up until a few weeks ago, the timeline was still somewhat unknown. It could be weeks, it could be months. And in the last couple weeks, it became clear that it was going to be closer to days and weeks rather than months. So when I got the news, my first reaction, if I'm honest, my first reaction was, oh, well, thank goodness her suffering is over. Thank goodness her suffering is over. Thank goodness her kids and her husband don't have to watch her suffer anymore. Thank goodness her suffering is over. And there's nothing wrong with that, actually. There's nothing wrong with feeling that or thinking that, but I was struck by this fact. Why did I go there first? Why did I immediately go to the good news in the midst of all of this? Because the situation itself is awful. This woman was 53 years old. She was as gifted and talented of a person as I have ever met. She worked with teenagers with ease. She loved her church, she loved her family, she loved her 4 kids, she loved her husband. To say that this was a life cut too short is an understatement of epic proportions. And when I thought about that, when I thought about the facts of the whole situation, well, that's when the sadness hit. That's when the emotion hit. That's when what I was really feeling came to the surface. I'll be the first to admit I don't do well with grief. I don't do well with loss. I still remember clearly my first funeral. I was 10 years old. My great uncle Raymond had passed away. And I remember walking around the funeral home, trying my darndest to fight back the tears that needed to come. As the youngest cousin, I spent a lot of time going to funerals as a kid. For great-grandparents and for grandparents and for aunts and uncles, and eventually even for friends. And the trait that would describe my reaction to all those things, to all the loss, to all the grief, was to rush through it. To avoid those feelings of pain and loss and immediately look for the silver lining in the midst of all of it. So there is some irony that I am sharing this message with you on Good Friday. Because my first act of teenage rebellion as a middle school student was to tell my parents that I was not going to Maundy, Thursday, or Good Friday service anymore. That I was done. That I went to church every other Sunday of the year. But those services were too sad for me. I wasn't going. Now, as a credit to my parents, they agreed. They didn't fight me on that. I was right. I went to church every other Sunday. They were willing to let Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday go. But the truth is that even as a kid, feelings of grief and loss and suffering were not ones I wanted to indulge. I was perfectly content as a kid to run from Palm Sunday, from the joy, the celebration, the excitement of Palm Sunday, into the all-overwhelming joy of victory over death of Easter, and skip right over Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. When I was in seminary, I wrote a paper. It was 21 pages long. It was my longest paper I ever wrote. And it was on the death of Jesus. I read commentary after commentary. I translated it myself. I read entire books, multi-volume sets on the death of Jesus to prepare for this paper. And as I was writing it and I was getting to the end, I realized something about this text, about this death of Jesus story from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from all four. They all end the same way. They all end in silence. All we know is that Jesus dies, he's buried, and that's it. That's it. We hear about the burial, and then we don't hear anything else until Easter Sunday. And I remember thinking, well, what do you think the disciples did? Like Friday after all this happened, what did they do on Saturday? And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, they probably went back and did the normal things. They probably went back and saw their families, and they probably went back and they went fishing. And we even know that they went fishing. They probably tried to go back to living life as though it were normal. And yet I have a theory and a suspicion that in the midst of that, in the midst of the death of Jesus, his immediate followers, they tried to go back to normal, but there was no going back to normal for them. You see, even if they went fishing as they were grieving. What's more likely than anything is no matter what the disciples did, no matter how they filled their time that night and again on Saturday, they most likely did so while they were grieving. Grieving a loss of a friend. Grieving the loss of hopes. Think about it. For some of those disciples, they had spent 3 years of their life committed to following him everywhere that he went. They had pinned all their hopes, all their dreams, all their futures were pinned on Jesus. And then suddenly, in a course of a matter of days and even a course of a matter of hours, it all seemed to come to a crashing end. They were probably concerned for their own safety. They had scattered after his arrest. What if the authorities came for them next? So fear and grief and anguish and wondering, some of them, I'm sure, could we have done something different? What went wrong here? You see, they couldn't do what we can do. They couldn't move from the joy of Palm Sunday and the celebration of the victorious King. They couldn't skip over Maundy, Thursday. They couldn't skip over Good Friday. They couldn't run ahead to Easter morning. No, they knew that everything that they had dreamed of and hoped for and imagined and lived and worked for suddenly seemed to come to a crashing halt on that cross. All their hopes, all their joy seemed to be gone, and all that was left was silence and nothingness. You see, I think what the disciples did after Good Friday was mourn. They were sad. They experienced grief and loss, the fullness of all of human emotion. And even on some level, I wonder if some of them didn't feel betrayed. That they had given their life to this cause, that they had poured everything they had into following Jesus, only to see the whole thing go downhill in the last 48 hours. So I think they grieved. I think they grieved what they lost. I think they grieved for their friend. Grief's a human emotion. It's not one I like, I didn't say that, but it is a human emotion, and it is a very healthy thing. The act of grieving is crucially important. Grieving what has been lost is important for moving forward. And I know as a pastor, grieving is hard, and it's weird, and it's strange, because I've done funerals for people where for the 45 minutes or an hour of the service, I held my composure and I preached with gusto the hope of the resurrection, only while on the inside knowing that I was not okay, that I had not grieved the loss of this friend, that I had not grieved the loss of this person. I always say things like, we grieve in joy, we grieve in hope, and we do. We do. The Apostle Paul in Romans has beautiful language about how we are to grieve, how we are to find hope, even in the most dire of circumstances. And I believe all that. I really do. But I wonder if the lesson I've had to learn isn't one that we just need to become more comfortable with, and that is take time to grieve and to mourn. You can't run from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday without going through Maundy, Thursday, and yes, Good Friday. A few weeks ago, I was sitting with someone who I just met, and she was talking about how for her, there's a beauty in indulging the pain and suffering of life. That didn't resonate with me at all. I mean, why do it? Why indulge the pain and suffering of life? Run from it, get away from it, avoid it. And she made a comment. She said, in the midst of pain and suffering, if we're willing to indulge it, we can mine from it goodness, joy, and hope. That there's beauty to be found in the midst of pain. As I said, this seemed very foreign to me. I mean, what are you talking about? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. That in the midst of grief and loss, there's a beauty in being able to mine from that experience something redemptive, something holy, something wonderful. I remember one of my college professors telling us once that until you understood the magnitude of your sin, you couldn't understand the magnitude of God's grace. I think the parallel holds true here too. Until you engage, until you allow yourself to feel and to grieve the loss, that is where you discover God's incredible faithfulness and God's hope in the midst of it. So, over a lot of time and a lot of Good Friday services, I have learned a hard lesson. Indulge the grief. Let it feel real. Don't run from it. For truly, in the depth of human loss and pain and suffering, that is where we discover God's faithfulness and God's hope. In the midst of the global pandemic in which we find ourselves, I am always looking for the optimism. I have been looking at charts and graphs and reading, and at this moment there are small signs of optimism ahead, that in fact the curve is flattening and that a new normal is somewhere on the horizon. And I like being a glass half full optimist. I really do. I like it. It's encouraging to me. It's encouraging to others. I've always tried to find the silver lining in things, and I don't think that that's bad. And yet I'm mindful that there is a very real loss for people in the midst of this. Here in our local community, we have not, fortunately, been extremely hard hit by COVID, at least not yet. But in other parts of the country, it has been devastating. We have friends in New York City. I have a colleague of mine who serves a church there who has told me of the devastation that they are experiencing. People are experiencing very real suffering because of this. In the lives of our own churches, and we're finding out that the normal things of life are happening. Weddings are having to be rescheduled. Funerals are having to be delayed. Those kinds of rites of passage that we use to mark the beginning and the end are all on hold. This Holy Week, the most sacred week for all of us, we're not gathering. There's no communion bread being handed out. There's no cups being shared. There's no hugs. There's no handshakes. That's all on hold. And for a group that's near and dear to my heart, high school kids, this has been devastating. Devastating. I mean, think about it. You're a high school senior. You've worked for 12 years. This is your 13th year of school. You are ready to graduate and enjoy your senior prom and graduation and all those things, those last memories. And they're gone. They're over. They're not happening. Think about college students, college seniors in the same spot, who, in addition to missing out on all their laughs, are now looking at an uncertain economic future of what will our economy look like. And can we talk about people who live alone? Can we talk about people who have not seen in a meaningful way another person in weeks now? And the loss and separation and grief that they are feeling. I look online and I see pictures of virtual meetings with grandparents and even meeting with them in the front yard and waving through the window. This separation that we're enduring, it's exacting a cost on us. It's exacting an economic cost, yes, but it's exacting a personal cost on us. It's exacting a spiritual cost on us. Now, please don't get me wrong. I 100% support the social distancing restrictions that have been put in place. They are necessary. They will save lives. But we're paying a price for this. We're paying a price. Rites of passage are not happening. People are dying. And the very rituals that give us meaning and celebration are not happening. So there's a temptation, if you're like me, to run ahead, to find the optimistic news story you can and read it and go on with your life, and to look for the silver lining in all of it. Look for the time I've had at home with my family and my kids and all those things, all the silver linings, and there are so many of them. And yet, there's a danger. There's a danger in not grieving what has been lost. There's a danger in not accepting the things that we're missing out on right now, that we so need. There's a danger in not grieving over the separation that we're experiencing. And so I think it's fitting, actually. I think it's fitting that this has fallen during our most holiest of weeks. So as we gather on this day, as we gather on this Good Friday, let us remember that the Christian tradition to which we claim, the Christian tradition that calls Jesus the Son of God, the Christian tradition that sets us free, also teaches us that there is a place, a very real place, for mourning and for grieving. May this Good Friday service be an opportunity and occasion for you to reflect carefully on what it is that you have lost, be it this week, be it this month, be it this year. And know that there is nothing unchristian about grieving. There's nothing unchristian about sadness. There's nothing unchristian about feeling the loss. There's no need to run ahead to be happy. For our Good Friday story ends in silence. The silence that didn't know what was next, that didn't see hope on the horizon. How much more can we rest, reflect, and grieve, knowing that hope is on the horizon? Amen.